All right. Well, today on the show, we are excited to have Don Everts with us today. Don, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you. Great to have you. So, Don, I would love to. I'd love to hear a little bit about your story. You've got the book out, The Hopeful Neighborhood. The Hopeful Neighborhood Field Guide is about to be released.
Hmm.
And not only is this a book and a guide, this is an entire process. I'd love to hear a little bit of your story and where this came from.
Yeah, the genesis of a lot of this came from wonderful nagging questions.
Hmm.
so that I was asking, that my friend Tony Cook was asking, and questions like, how are Christians and how am I relating to the people and the place right around where I live? My literal neighbors, right? And I have lived a somewhat nomadic life, Mark. I've lived in I did the math. I've lived in 30 different neighborhoods
Oh my
in my
gosh.
life, and so um, I how you attach to a place, how you think about a place, how you relate with the place around you is something I've thought a lot about, and have just been kind of followed around by these nagging questions. Does Jesus have an opinion about that? Does Jesus have an opinion about how people relate with the people who live right around them and how they relate with the place right around them? And so those questions are part of the story. My friend Tony Cook, who's part of this whole project, this Hopeful Neighborhood project we're starting, similar questions that he was asking, and I was down in Tennessee a couple years ago at a Christian conference, and I was reading a Wendell Berry novel. It was my first novel I'd ever read by Wendell Berry, and he's a Christian essayist and farmer and novelist. And it was this beautiful story about Jayber Crow, who lived on this fictional in this little town on a river, and it was about the richness of his relationship with the place and with
Hmm.
the people, and what he called the membership of the town, which included all the animals and all the trees and all the people. And it was a really rich description, and it kind of dialed up the volume on all those questions I had been asking, and that made me plunge into the Bible. What does God say about the people in place right around us, and does God have an opinion about how we should relate with them? It made me dive into research. Tony and I worked with the Barna Group to do nationwide research on how Christians are currently relating with the people in place right around them, and made me dive into lots of conversations and reading on these topics. So that's what led to not only the research project that we did, and with Barna, we published the results of that, but also this book that we're working on, a field guide, which is actually for Christians and non-Christians, so that Christians and non-Christians together can be doing things in their neighborhood. And then this whole, as you said, this whole process, online national network that we're launching, and all the things.
Yeah. One of the things that kind of stood out to me that I kind of was thinking as I was reading the book and looking at the website is a lot of churches just the go-to mentality is let's have a new program to reach our neighborhood. Let's
Yeah,
have a new
yeah,
initiative to reach our neighborhood. And you are talking about literally being neighbors.
that's right.
And
Yes.
so I wonder, could you just flesh out what is
Yeah.
the difference? Because I do think there's a stark difference in what you're
Yes.
saying and
Yes.
the way that a lot of churches just approach how are we going to reach our city, make an impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that difference as well, because what's fascinating when we do our research, and previous research we've done with the Barna Group as well, tells us that trust for the church and for kind of Christian authorities is pretty low right now in our country.
Mm, yeah.
In kind of our postmodern, if you will, kind of landscape, there's a general distrust for authorities in general, but Christian authorities, churches, church organizations, etc. It didn't used to be that way, right? But it is that way right now. And so I think in a previous time when there was trust for churches, organizations, doing kind of a program like the church, quote unquote, is doing a program was fine. But right now, what we find is that, when we ask people in the research, for example, who do you think is well equipped to help kind of improve your neighborhood and deal with issues in the neighborhood? And we give them lots of different options. Uh, the answer, the church, ranked lower than government. It
Mm,
ranked lower than lots of different things. It was very, very low, Mark. And so, in an era when people are not receptive to the church coming in and doing a program, here's what's fascinating. At the top of the list, near the top of the list, in terms of who people trust to make a difference in their neighborhood, is someone who lives in the neighborhood,
mm,
a neighbor. People are open to working with someone who lives in the neighborhood. Well, I trust you. You're a neighbor. You want good things for my neighborhood. I know you. We have a relationship with each other. And so that's why our focus has taken the direction of not how does a congregation do a program to quote unquote reach out, but rather how do we mobilize Christians and equip them to gather a small group of neighbors together, Christian or non-Christian,
mhm,
to make a difference in the neighborhood. And interestingly, what we're finding is that does two things. One, people in the neighborhood are receptive because it's a neighbor. And number two, it's an opportunity for Christians to build trusting relationships with the non-Christians in their life. And and for those of us who have a passion about people hearing about Jesus, we know that the gospel is shared most fruitfully these days in the warm light of friendship and
mm,
trust. And so, uh, the benefits of equipping Christians to do something kind of entrepreneurial in their own neighborhood just really outweigh, in some ways, what a church can accomplish kind of formally through a program. So that's why we're going in that direction.
mm. One of the things that I thought was surprising was where the whole process starts is in the way that people actually think about their neighborhood.
Yeah.
Why is
Yeah.
that important? Why is the way that I think about where I live important
Mhm.
to how I'll actually serve and want to make a difference and be a neighbor?
Yeah, that's a great question. It, there's a Bible answer and a sociology answer.
Okay. All
so
right.
so the sociologists, that the research that they have done, has found that something changes when you take, and these are the terms they use, an asset-based approach to developing a community rather than a deficit-based approach. So traditionally, the default of a lot of people and organizations and agencies has been deficit-based. In other words, what's wrong in the neighborhood, and let's import into the neighborhood resources to fix what's wrong.
Hmm.
An asset-based approach, and this was really pioneered by research in the Chicago area by John McKnight, um, is what they call asset-based community development. When you say, let's look for what's strong in the neighborhood. Let's not start with what's wrong. Let's start with what's strong. What are the assets that are already there? And then from there say, well, what do those point to? So sociologists have found that what they call ABCD, asset-based community development, is actually more fruitful. It empowers people in the neighborhood. It produces ideas and projects that you never would have thought of. And deficit-based approaches, sometimes they can solve problems, but they tend to alienate people in the neighborhood because it kind of paints them like, well, you people in this neighborhood need help, you don't have the resources. So that's the sociological reason why, to start by saying, let me look for what's strong in my neighborhood. Interestingly, in the Bible we find the same thing, that God has given gifts, that every human he's created as a gift with gifts to share. We see this in Genesis. We see it all throughout the scripture, that part of the common grace that God has given to all of humanity is that he's created people with dignity and with gifts. And he calls them, right? They have vocation, not just that. I'm not talking about Christian vocation or Christian calling, but just that our creator, by giving us gifts, calls us to do things. And so doesn't that sound a lot like what the sociologists have wound their way to, like, hey, we should start by looking for what the gifts are. And we see that in the scripture, God says, everyone is a gift with gifts to share. And so that's why our approach, and what we encourage and equip people to do is to assess and do kind of an inventory in their neighborhood, not of what's wrong, not of what's annoying you,
Mhm.
but of what are the gifts that are already there? What are
Yeah.
the gifts that God has given your neighbors? What are the gifts that are built into the neighborhood itself and the environment and all that? Start by discovering the gifts. That's our first step in the 3-step process, is discovering the gifts. And interestingly, when people do that, not only are they kind of positioned to then use those gifts, but it kind of does something magical to how people feel about their neighborhood. That they come alive and realize, man, I didn't know my neighbors had these gifts. I've waved at them for 20 years, but I didn't know that, they were gifted in these ways. So that's why our encouragement in the Hopeful Neighborhood process and all of our tools are geared around starting by discovering the gifts that are already there in the neighborhood.
Hmm. I wonder, do you have a story that kind of you can use as an example of that? Maybe somebody in a community, and they went at that approach, that the assets in the community
But
approach, and it led
yeah,
to.
yeah. There's lots of stories. I'll share one that someone just sent to us from California.
Okay.
It was someone who had moved into a city, and it was interesting because they said that their first perception of the city that they had moved into was how dirty it was.
Mm,
And like their neighborhood, and again, they weren't used to the neighborhood, and they thought, man, it's kind of, things are broken down, things are kind of dirty. Like that was where they started from. And then through their church, now they happen to be in a church that takes the neighborhood that the church is in seriously, right? It's kind of a neighborhood church, if you will. And they were encouraged to be in relationship with neighbors, and the more they got to know the people around them, and they were just sharing this story of like, I can't believe my first impression was that it was dirty and run down. They said, now I look at my neighborhood and I see all of these gifted people, and all these gifts that they have, and they've started to make a difference with each other. They're doing things. This is in Fresno, and they're doing things in their Fresno neighborhood. um, they're hopeful, right? That's part of why we named it the Hopeful Neighborhood Project. Like when they first went in, they were a little kind of sad and depressed, like, man, this place isn't great. Is there any hope for this place? But when they started discovering, kind of meeting their neighbors and getting to know them, finding out what their neighbors were naturally gifted at, right? The gifts God had given them, they became hopeful. and
mm,
and they now love their neighborhood. They're way involved, and they and their neighbors are making a difference in the neighborhood. So that's just one kind of encouraging story of someone's honest transformation of like, their instinct was to look at what was wrong, but when their church was encouraging them to get to know people, they started seeing what was strong. And a light bulb went off. Like, hope is an interesting thing, isn't it? Hope,
yeah.
it doesn't matter if you didn't get much sleep last night if you're feeling hopeful this morning, right? It's energizing. It affects your spirit in different ways. So that was an encouraging story to hear.
Yeah, that is really powerful. One of the things um, that's in the book is you talk about communities who experience trauma.
Yeah.
And as I was reading that, I was thinking about just exactly what you're talking about here, the importance of seeing the assets, the gifts in our
Yes.
community.
Yeah.
Um, you know, just an example, the community that I live in just went through a traumatic experience several years ago. Major industry in the
Mm,
community just closed. It's
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
basically non-existent. and what that did, and still the implications of it today are
Sure.
fresh. The wound is still there.
Mm,
How do you heal a community that's experienced that kind of trauma that almost, you're talking about hope, and that trauma just almost sucks the hope right out of the community?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's good.
what, how do you move forward? How can you begin to heal something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's no easy answer, and
Yeah.
in some ways, right, that is always going to shape the community,
Okay.
right? And
Yeah.
and like in other words, it's never going to not have happened and not shape how things are going
Mhm.
forward. So part of it is doing the work of understanding the trauma that's there, right? So you were there when the trauma happened. If
Yeah.
someone moved into your neighborhood and into your community, right, it would be so important for them to, part of their learning to be, is there trauma in the community?
Mhm.
Is there something that has shaped people? So part of it is understanding and empathizing with the trauma that is there, and then, right, as Christians, um, there are certain assets that we have access to help us heal, right?
Mhm.
But the community as a whole, not everyone in the community is going to be a person of faith, and uh, so part of healing, I think, is this sense of empathy and understanding, right? Not sweeping it under the rug, not saying we'll just get over it, like really acknowledging it and being in the pain. And then there is something that starts to happen when we start looking forward, right? I mean, there's something about moving forward in a positive way, not forgetting what happened, but understanding what happened, and then pursuing, uh, making a difference in some way. Uh, that's why the Hopeful Neighborhood Project isn't necessarily all about doing huge, big projects. Some of it is like gather with a group of neighbors to do something small. Maybe it only takes you a month to do, but you've made a difference together. Now, two things have happened. You are shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, and that is healing. That
Yeah.
helps you get over it, right? There's something healing about relationships, and you've done something to make a difference. And celebrating that small success, again, it's not going to do away with the trauma, but it is going to help, uh, begin to build a new future with each other. So it's complex, and the larger the trauma, the more, like, sometimes professional, right, people being involved. I remember visiting New York. I was visiting a church, in upstate New York, maybe 10 years after 9/11.
Hmm.
And I tell you what, almost everyone I talked with had a story
Yeah.
about that day, and they had to talk about it. So part of it is like listening, empathizing, and then saying, okay, how do we move forward? What's a little thing that we can do, together, and that has a way of building hope. you
Yeah.
you can be hopeful, and feel the trauma at the same time, I think.
That's good. That's really good. So a key part of this, so many times, especially for churches, the process is for churches and for people,
Yeah.
not of faith and things like that. But so many times for churches, one of the struggles is, hey, we see what this church is doing in a completely other and different neighborhood. Let's do that here.
Let's do it here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so we're obsessed with other neighborhoods rather than
Yeah.
seeing ourselves as neighbors,
Yes.
ourselves. So even that mind shift has got to happen likely for the church, doesn't it?
It really does. And I've been a parish pastor for 12 years, and boy, I feel it. I feel that tug, and you hear a story, you see something that happens somewhere else, and you're like, I want that.
Yeah.
And so the temptation is, boy, I don't even have to think much if I just pluck up what they did, and then
Yeah.
we just implement it here. It's easier, right? So part of what starting by discovering gifts does is it forces you in a really joyful way, to incarnate and to kind of say, for right here, what are the gifts we have right here? And then this, which leads to the second step of the process. After you discover the gifts, you can imagine possibilities. If these are the gifts that are here, in people and in the neighborhood, what could we do? So that inductive process, start by looking at the gifts and then say, well, what could we do? What can we imagine? Then you're naturally doing something that is like tailor fit for the neighborhood you're in. Now, maybe you imagine a possibility and you're like, man, I think given the gifts we have, we should, we should plant fruit trees,
Mhm.
in this park, for a variety of reasons. Well, then, there's nothing wrong with saying, has any other church or any other community ever like started a fruit orchard right in the town? Okay, then you can go look, right? And find out, oh, these people did it over here. And great, learn from them. Are there best practices? Were there mistakes they made that you can learn from? There's nothing wrong with that, right? But you got to get things in the right order. And so that's why we encourage, discover the gifts in your neighborhood and then imagine possibilities, and we have tools to help people do that, uh, and that'll keep you from the mistake of saying, oh, I see a problem, here's how another neighborhood solved the similar problem.
Hmm.
Because then you run into all those problems that you were talking about earlier, right? That when you try to just transplant something in without thinking about the particulars and the people who live in your neighborhood, it requires us to use our noodles more that God gave us, right? It requires us to use our brains and to think about things, but the results are much more homegrown. They're much more tailor fit, to and in that sense, people are going to have greater ownership, right? It's hard to get people to own some program that you're transplanting, but if it's something that comes from their imagining it together, boy, ownership is high when you do it that way.
Yeah. And so you've referenced the process a few times. The first step in
Mm-hmm.
that process, like you've said, is to discover the gifts.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear you talk about what are some gifts that we should be looking for in our community.
good, good. So there are two basic types of gifts that we have found it's helpful to help people think about: individual gifts and then what we call neighborhood gifts.
Okay.
So the individual gifts are, these are what people have, these are what the neighbors have. And as Christians, we spend a lot of time thinking about, when we think about individual gifts, we tend to think about spiritual gifts.
Yes. Yeah.
Depending on which church you're in, right? You think
Mhm.
different ways about it, but we tend to think about those. But there are common gifts that God gives to all humanity, right? And so those are like artistic gifts,
Mm.
leadership gifts, organizational gifts, mechanical gifts, mathematical gifts, all these different kinds. And so our research that we did with Barna, we wound up identifying 12 types of individual gifts that people tend to have, and so we developed a whole kind of research based online, it's totally free assessment that people can take, and it isn't just which of these gifts do you think it has little stories, and like, do you ever find yourself doing this? It's like a research based way of helping people identify some primary, secondary, and tertiary gifts that they have, and those are really helpful to kind of name, when you're wanting to make a difference in a neighborhood. If someone has communication gifts, well, okay, well, when we go to the neighborhood association, will you be the one who talks about what we're doing? You have organization gifts, great. We want to have this neighborhood yard sale to raise money for the school. Could you help organize, what we would do? Once you know the individual gifts that people have, ideas, right, in terms of how to get people using those gifts. So individual gifts are one type of gift that uh, people can discover. The other kind, we call them neighborhood gifts. So these are things like the environment, like what's in the environment. You have a park, maybe, uh, and maybe you take it for granted, but that's in the neighborhood, and that represents an asset, right? There are associational gifts, like, we have a really strong Kiwanis Club, right? It's this association, it's this group of people, and that actually represents a gift. We have physical gifts, like uh, the VFW hall that people can rent and use, and we have good sidewalks, and so helping people look not just at the people, but also at the place around them to discover both individual gifts and neighborhood gifts. And we've developed a neighborhood gift map to help people see what maybe they take for granted, like, oh, I guess we do have a lot of trees, or oh, we do have lots of churches in our neighborhood, right? For a non-Christian to even say, yeah, that represents an asset for us. So those are the kind of two journeys, like discovering individual gifts that people have and discovering the neighborhood gifts. Interestingly, Mark, Christians, we have found Christians find it so fascinating to discover their common gifts, because we're so used to just thinking about gifts as like apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, teacher, right? That
Yeah.
those are the gifts, and do I have any of those? And if I don't, okay, then I'll volunteer to usher, or whatever, right? But
Yeah.
we tend to just think about our gifts relative to the working of a church, which is a beautiful thing. I think that's a beautiful, and that we're meant to use our gifts in the church. But we tend to be pretty myopic, and Christians find it really refreshing to broaden out and say, I'm really good at these other things as well. They're not quote unquote spiritual,
Mm.
but how can I use those to pursue the common good and to bless people around me and build trust with my non-Christian neighbors? It's a really fun process of discovering gifts.
That's great. What is that process? How would you go about? I know you've referenced several times. You guys have resources that people can go
Sure.
to,
Yeah.
but is that hey, this group, these people are going to come together for this project to try to do this, and then they begin to have that conversation about their gifts.
Yeah.
How does this process work?
Great question. Great question. Now, the gift assessment that we've developed is available for anyone. So I'll just say that first. It's called Every Gift. You can Google it, and it's free, and it's, gives you a personalized report at the end. So anyone can do that. But the process that we do have, yes, is we have hopefulneighborhood.org, where people can go in, and if they decide, like, I want to try this with my neighbors, right? Then they can sign up. Again, it's all totally free.
Hmm.
They sign up, and we have this online process that kind of walks them through. Okay, first step, discover the gifts. What do you do first to discover the gifts? How do you gather a group of neighbors around you to do this?
That's good.
And so we have an online process, kind of a checklist, if you will, to walk them through. And then we also have coaches. So we have these neighborhood coaches that a team, once you have a small group of people in a neighborhood, they can follow along and kind of use the resources that walk them through the three steps. But they also have this coach that they can call up and say, hey, we're doing, this. Do you have any advice for us on how to get to know more of our neighbors, for example, or whatever it is? So we have this kind of online process, coaches standing by, and then starting March 1st, and that's when all of this launches. Starting March 1st, we're creating this kind of nationwide forum and network where we're connecting people with other small groups of neighbors in other places, where people can share best practices, hear each other's stories. Like, man, there's a small group of neighbors over in this town in Kentucky who did this. That's kind of what we've been talking about. So kind of some social learning, right, where we can
Mhm.
learn from each other, learn from a coach. And then just, again, hopefulneighborhood.org, there's this online process where we're creating these tools. Barna is helping us, InterVarsity Press is helping us, just different partners who are helping us create kind of free tools that people can use to do this in their own neighborhood and give it a try.
Yeah. And so imagine, discover the gifts, and then and then the second
Yes.
part of your process is imagine the possibilities.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
a key part of that was collaboration,
Yes.
working with other groups, and churches a lot of times struggle with collaboration.
We do.
You know,
We
uh,
do.
why why do you think churches, specifically churches, and again,
Yeah.
this process
Yeah.
includes all kinds of different groups, but
Sure. Sure.
churches struggle with this? Why should churches think about and work for collaboration?
That's a great question. There's like a whole other 45-minute conversation we could have about that.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think you're right. Why are we so allergic to collaboration? I think some of it comes from a really beautiful desire to um, stick to truth. We have this desire, this beautiful thing. Like, we don't want to succumb to the culture around us. We don't want to succumb to the world around us. We're in the world, but not of the world, right? And so there can be this. I think that's why some churches can kind of close ranks and kind of huddle together and not want to be in conversation with other people, which is what collaboration is all about, right?
Yeah.
Collaboration is like, well, this is how I see it. How do you see it? Uh, so that's my initial response of why maybe we're a little bit allergic to collaboration. But the beautiful thing about collaboration, like especially like in a neighborhood like we're talking about here, there's a few fruits that come of it. Number one, uh, we're learning from other people's expertise. I mean, you've heard as many, you and your listeners have probably heard as many horror stories as I have of some well-meaning group going into a neighborhood that they don't know with preset assumptions and saying, we're going to solve your problems this way, and it blows up and it doesn't work
Yeah.
because they don't understand the neighborhood, they don't understand the people there. And so one of the fruits that comes from collaborating with others is learning from their expertise, their experience, their perspective. This is why we encourage people to collaborate with a diversity of people. If you're young, make sure you're talking to someone who's older. If
Mm.
you're older, make sure you're talking to someone who's younger. So cross-cultural collaboration is especially rich, right? Because you're gaining wisdom from different people, which will protect you from making mistakes based on your false assumptions. But another fruit that comes from collaboration is that we are building trusting, genuine relationships with other people. And one of the things I do a lot, Mark, is help train churches do evangelism and like create an evangelism culture in their church. And it's interesting. One of the biggest barriers that I have found that's common to most churches actually doing relational evangelism is that people in the church don't know non-Christians. Like, they don't have I mean, maybe they know them, but they don't have genuine friendships with people who don't share their faith. And one of the benefits of collaboration, like we're talking about here, you're going to get better possibilities. You're going to imagine better stuff if you collaborate, but you're also going to be building friendships that, if the Holy Spirit wills it, could lead to someone learning more about your faith. So you're right, brother. We struggle with collaboration, but boy, is it a fruitful thing to learn how to do.
Yeah. And so the goal of collaboration is, and this right into the last part of the process, is the common
Yeah,
good. We're working for the
that's
common
that's
good.
it. Yeah,
Uh, I would just love to hear you talk about, define what is the common good.
yeah. The common good. It's interesting because the common good used to be a very common parlance in the Christian church.
Mm.
For centuries, people understood that we were called to pursue the common good. I mean, early on. I mean, you even see it like in Peter's letter, right? Peter's writing to a group of people who are in Asia Minor who are being persecuted, and one of the things he says to them is do good. Like, it's not illegal to do good and bless the people around you. But we see it back, when Jeremiah writes the letter to the exiles in Babylon, where and none of them want to be in Babylon. They're like, we just want to hold our breath till we can head back to the promised land. And God's word to them through the letter that Jeremiah sent was, seek the welfare of the city that I've sent you to.
Mm.
That's the common good, right? The welfare of the people. And so the common good is that flourishing and well-being in every area of life, with the people, with the relationships, with the systems, right? Everything about a place, that you want it to be going well. and to be lifted up. And so there's a huge stream of biblical calling where God calls his people to pursue peace, right? Shalom. That rich sense of shalom that we have in the scripture is actually it's the common good. It's we want things to be going well with on every area of life. Good businesses, safe streets, good schools, right? People are friendly. We want all the things going well. So whether you call it shalom, whether you call it welfare of the city, like Jeremiah, whether you call it doing good deeds, you think of Jesus as saying, if, you're a light on a hill when people see your good deeds, right? That we do good things. We want to lift other people up. So that calling, I would say, has been lost a little bit in the shadow to our calling to proclaim the gospel,
Hmm.
right? So, which is also good, right? I'm not saying this is one or the other, right? We have been called by God from the beginning to pursue the common good of the people in the place right around us. Also, we are called to share the good news about Jesus, but that doesn't displace or replace pursuing the common good and wanting neighborhoods to be safe and people to have healthy food and people to have physical health and safety in the streets and for all those things. And so when we talk about the third step, once you discover the gifts in the neighborhood, then you imagine possibilities like how could we make a difference? What could we do? Then you pursue the common good. You together pursue the well-being. Now, because we're out of practice, some of us in as Christians, in thinking about well-being and the common good, we have developed this tool called the well-being window,
Hmm.
which helps people look through, and we've even developed an assessment tool, and people can go to neighbors and just ask them questions and kind of discern, well, where is the well-being, how is the well-being, how is the common good doing these days in the different areas. And so we have these 4 different quadrants you can look through and different neighborhood health indicators. So I could bore you with the details of it, but all that is to say, because we're a little bit out of the practice of thinking about our God-given call to pursue the common good of everyone around us, um, we've developed some tools to help people start reclaiming that part of our Christian heritage, that biblical calling that we
Yeah.
have.
And to take back up that call to do good in our neighborhoods,
Yeah,
open up the door for evangelism.
exactly. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
Yeah, not only are they not mutually exclusive, they're synergistic.
that's right.
And that's, Jesus said, he said, you are the light of the world, like a city on a hill, it cannot be hidden. And what did he say? When people see your good works, they will give glory to your Father who is in heaven.
That's
So
good.
Jesus himself said, when they see you like just being a blessing and doing good deeds, there is a way that will bring glory to God. That people will find out what you've done. That's why Peter, right? Peter writes his letter and he's like, I know you're taking it on the chin, and you're in the minority now, and it's not fun being a Christian in Asia Minor. He said, but do good. And then what does he say elsewhere in the letter? He says, and when people come to you and say, why are you so hopeful? He said, always be prepared with an answer to tell people why, of the reason for the hope that is inside of you. Be willing and ready to explain. So again, it's right there. It's just like you said, Mark, our pursuing of the common good tends to be synergistic with sharing the good news of Jesus.
Hmm. Yeah. And so where does it start? So for the person that's watching this, listening to this, that and they're thinking,
Hmm.
"Hey, I'm in.
Yeah, yeah,
I want to do this." Where do they start? Do you have a recommendation? This is the first thing you need to
yeah.
do. This is exactly how this process is going to go for the individual.
Yes. Obviously people could just go to hopefulneighborhood.org and,
Yeah.
learn about the process, sign up and everything. But I'll say this, what we've found is there's a pre-step for most people,
Okay.
right? So 1, 2, 3, there's 3 steps: discover the gifts, imagine the possibilities, pursue the common good. But what we've found is a pre-step that some people need is to get to know their neighborhood again
Hmm.
and to get to know their neighbors. There's a phrase I've run across. It's living above place. And it's a word used to describe people who are living their life without any meaningful interaction with the people or the place right around where they live. So, they commute to church, they commute to work, they commute to school, whatever it is. So they live a relational life, but they're living without any meaningful engagement with the people in the place right around them. A lot of us are that way. I'm tempted to live that way. Doing this research, Mark, has been very sobering for me, realizing, man, I've fallen into it. I'm living above place. And so for a lot of people, the first step is going to be go on a drive, go on a walk, and start getting reacquainted with your neighborhood and with your neighbors. We found a lot of people are in the situation. They've said, well, I've lived here 20 years. I would be embarrassed to go to my neighbor that I've been waving to for 20 years and say, you know what? I don't even know your name. I've
Wow.
lived next to you for 20 years. You've never had a meal at my house. I don't even know your name. And we wave at the mailbox all the time. And so we've just said, just make fun of it and say, you know what? It occurred to me, I've been waving at you for 20 years. I forgot your name. I'm sorry. My name's Don. What's your name? So the first step for most people, just become reacquainted with your neighborhood. In fact, we created a little tool, a little playful tool called Neighborhood Bingo. And so we have these bingo cards, and each of the squares is filled with a little thing you could do to get reacquainted with your neighborhood. And so we even have these little prizes and stickers and decals people can get if they get a bingo and say, okay, I'm going to do these 5 things to get to know my neighborhood better. So there's things big and little we can do to start getting to know the neighborhood again. That's a pre-step that will bless anyone. And I think especially in these times when people tend to be pretty cut off from others, and a
Mhm.
lot of us are kind of sequestered in our neighborhoods. Not as many people are commuting. You know, uh, say hi, get
Mhm.
reacquainted.
Yeah. Well, Don, this has been great. I love how simple and just practical this is, that we're all neighbors. And
That's right.
so nobody hears this and says, that's not me. Uh,
That's right.
that's just powerful.
Yeah.
So Don, you said earlier that March the 1st
Yes.
is when a lot of this drops
Yep.
online, things like
Yep.
that. So walk us through that. What happens on March 1st? What comes out? Where can people connect with the
Wonderful.
resources, things like that?
Great. So we have a lot of this research is being done through Lutheran Hour Ministries, where is my research partner that I work with. And so if people go to lhm.org/together, we have a list of a lot of the resources that we've developed. You can find the neighborhood bingo, for example. So on March 1st, that page will show all the things. So the book that I wrote that came out last fall that you mentioned, called The Hopeful Neighborhood, What Happens When Christians Pursue the Common Good, it's published with InterVarsity Press. So that's one thing. You also mentioned the Hopeful Neighborhood Field Guide. We're also doing that with InterVarsity Press. And that's something people can use with their neighbors. That is released on March 1st.
Yeah.
Our website, hopefulneighborhood.org, people can find stuff on that right now, but on March 1st, it will be fully live. And so people can learn about the process. They can sign up with their team. They can get a coach, start doing the process. So all that stuff kind of starts to come to bear on March 1st. And so those two places, the hopefulneighborhood.org and then the lhm.org/together, are two places that on March 1st people can see all the different things and figure out for them, hey, what's the best place for me to start? I mean, we've even created little children's books, little children's
Yeah.
booklets. We have one called I Love My Neighborhood. That's all
Mm.
about helping kids understand some of these things. We have a children's book called Precious in His Sight, which helps children understand that God has made every person precious as a gift with gifts to share. So we have lots of different booklets, everything from a little kid's booklet and a bingo card all the way up to a nationwide network. So
Yeah.
hopefully anyone can find anything for the nagging questions or the curiosity that they have.
Yeah. And is there a way people can connect with you online, social media, or anything like that?
Sure, yeah. I'm not hugely active on social media. I'm kind of a boring follow, but yes, at Don Everts on the Twitter and Instagram. That's right.
All right. Well, great, great. Hey, Don, this was great. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk today. Thanks.
Well, great to be with you and to think a little bit about churchology and how we can be making a difference. Thanks, Mark.